Hello, my dear sleepy listeners. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the mists of early medieval Kent, exploring the life of one of England's most mysterious rulers, Octha, the shadowy successor of Kent. We'll softly discover how this enigmatic king consolidated the foundations laid by his legendary grandfather Hengist, defended Kent's fertile lands against British resistance, and maintained power during one of the most turbulent periods in English history, all while the great Arthur himself may have stood as his greatest rival. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Even if you're feeling a bit shy, just share which period of early English history fascinates you most. Your gentle thoughts help our Sleepy Crown family grow. And if these soothing historical tales help you find rest, please like this video and subscribe to keep these calming stories coming your way. So cozy up under your blanket, close your eyes, and let the gentle whispers from 6th century Kent carry you softly towards sleep. If you're new here, welcome to our peaceful circle of dreamers. Octha, later known as King Octa of Kent, emerged from the shadows of legend to rule one of England's first Germanic kingdoms during the twilight years of the 5th century and the dawn of the 6th. His story begins not with his own birth, but with the slow collapse of a world that had endured for nearly 4 centuries, Roman Britain. As the last Roman legions departed Britain's shores around 410 CE, they left behind a patchwork of Romano-British kingdoms struggling to maintain order against an increasingly chaotic world. The great stone walls of Londinium still stood tall, but the administrative machinery that had governed from Hadrian's Wall to the Channel coast was crumbling like autumn leaves in a forgotten garden. In this twilight world, local strongmen and tribal leaders filled the vacuum left by imperial authority. Some, like the mysterious British King Vortigern, still dreamed of maintaining Roman-style civilization. Others embraced the old Celtic ways that had never truly disappeared beneath the veneer of Roman culture. But all faced the same pressing reality: waves of raiders from across the North Sea who saw Britain's weakness as their opportunity. The fertile lands of Kent, with their proximity to the continental mainland and their rich river valleys, became a natural target for these seafaring peoples. Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians, had been crossing the Channel for generations, sometimes as traders, sometimes as raiders, and increasingly as settlers seeking new homes, as their own territories faced pressure from migrating peoples further east. It was into this uncertain world that 2 brothers arrived on Britain's shores around 428 CE, their names destined to echo through centuries of legend and chronicle. Hengist and Horsa, their very names meaning stallion and horse, landed on the Isle of Thanet with 3 shiploads of warriors, ostensibly at the invitation of the British King Vortigern himself. The story, as preserved in the chronicles of later centuries, speaks of a desperate bargain struck between a beleaguered British ruler and ambitious Germanic mercenaries. Vortigern, facing pressure from Pictish raiders in the north and Irish raiders in the west, had decided to employ the old Roman strategy of hiring barbarians to fight barbarians. He granted Hengist and Horsa land in exchange for military service, a decision that would echo through the corridors of history with tragic irony. In those early days, the arrangements seemed to work well for both parties. The Germanic warriors proved effective against the northern raiders, their fierce fighting skills and intimate knowledge of seafaring warfare serving British interests admirably. Hengist, the elder brother, demonstrated not only prowess in battle, but also a shrewd political mind that grasped the opportunities presented by Britain's fragmented state. The early relationship between the Germanic newcomers and their British employers was complex, woven from threads of mutual necessity, cultural curiosity, and growing tension. The warriors who had crossed the North Sea brought with them not just swords and shields, but entire cultural traditions, their own gods, their own laws, their own ways of understanding loyalty, honor, and kinship. These traditions would prove remarkably adaptable to British soil, yet also fundamentally transformative. As months turned to years, Hengist began to understand the true weakness of post-Roman Britain. The British kingdoms, despite their pretensions to Roman civilization, lacked the administrative unity and military organization that had made Rome's rule so effective. Local loyalties often trumped broader political concerns, and the absence of a professional army meant that defense depended on militia forces that could be effective in their own territories, but struggled to coordinate across larger areas. This understanding led Hengist to make a fateful decision. Rather than remaining content as a mercenary leader in service to British kings, he began to envision something far grander: the establishment of his own kingdom on British soil. The fertile lands of Kent, with their strategic position controlling sea routes to the continent, presented an irresistible opportunity for a man of his ambitions and capabilities. The transformation from mercenary to ruler was neither sudden nor simple. It required careful political maneuvering, the gradual accumulation of loyal followers, and the patient cultivation of alliances with other Germanic groups still arriving from across the sea. Hengist understood that his small band of warriors, however skilled, could not hope to hold territory against determined British resistance without reinforcement and expansion. Chronicles suggest that Hengist began sending messages back to his homeland, describing the richness of British soil and the opportunities available for enterprising warriors willing to risk the sea crossing. These messages bore fruit in the form of additional ships carrying fresh warriors, craftsmen, and even families seeking new homes in a new land. What had begun as a mercenary expedition was gradually transforming into a migration. The relationship between Hengist's growing Germanic community and the British population was complex and varied significantly across different areas of Kent. In some regions, the newcomers settled alongside existing Romano-British inhabitants, leading to communities where Germanic and British customs blended in fascinating ways. Archaeological evidence suggests that in many areas, the transition was relatively peaceful, with Germanic settlers adopting some Roman-British practices while introducing their own traditions. However, this gradual transformation inevitably generated tension with British leaders who recognized the long-term implications of Germanic settlement. As Hengist's followers grew in number and confidence, their relationship with Vortigern and other British kings became increasingly strained. The Germanic settlers were no longer simply hired swords who could be dismissed when their services were no longer needed. They had become a permanent presence with their own interests and ambitions. The breaking point came when political tensions finally erupted into open warfare. The exact details vary between different chronicle accounts, but most agree that the conflict began over issues of payment, territory, and political authority. Hengist, now established with a substantial following in Kent, was no longer willing to accept the subordinate position of a mercenary leader. He had tasted the possibilities of independent rule and found them irresistibly appealing. The war that followed was brutal but relatively brief. Germanic warriors, fighting on terrain they now knew intimately and motivated by the prospect of winning permanent homes for their families, proved formidable opponents. British resistance, hampered by the same political fragmentation that had created the crisis in the first place, struggled to mount an effective coordinated response. Victory at the Battle of Aylesford in 455 CE marked a crucial turning point in Hengist's fortunes and in the broader history of Kent. Brother Horsa, fell in the fighting, but the Germanic forces achieved a decisive victory that established their permanent control over significant portions of Kentish territory. This battle represented more than just a military victory. It marked the transition from temporary mercenary employment to permanent territorial conquest. With Horsa's death, Hengist faced the challenge of consolidating his gains while managing the grief and anger of his followers. The loss of his brother was both a personal tragedy and a political crisis, as Horsa had been not just a family member, but also a crucial military leader whose death left a significant gap in the Germanic leadership structure. Hengist's response to this crisis demonstrated the political acumen that had brought him so far. Rather than allowing grief to paralyze his efforts, he channeled the emotions of his followers into a renewed commitment to establishing permanent Germanic rule in Kent. Horsa became a martyr figure whose memory served to strengthen rather than weaken the Germanic cause. The years following Aylesford saw the systematic expansion of Germanic control throughout Kent. This was not simply a matter of military conquest, but also of careful political and economic organization. Hengist understood that lasting rule required more than military prowess. It demanded the creation of institutions and traditions that could outlast any individual ruler. The establishment of what became known as the Kingdom of Kent represented a remarkable achievement in early medieval state building. Unlike the chaotic warlordism that characterized much of post-Roman Europe, Hengist created a political structure that combined Germanic tribal traditions with lessons learned from observing Roman administrative practices and British political organization. Central to this achievement was the development of a royal dynasty that could provide continuity beyond Hengist's own lifetime. The king understood that personal charisma and military success, while essential for gaining power, were insufficient for maintaining it across generations. He needed to establish institutions and traditions that would preserve Germanic rule in Kent even after his own death. This dynastic thinking led to careful attention to marriage alliances, succession planning, and the cultivation of loyal noble families who could serve as the backbone of royal administration. Hengist's court became a center not just of military planning, but also of political innovation, as Germanic traditions adapted to the realities of governing a settled territorial kingdom. The cultural transformation that accompanied political conquest was equally significant. Kent under Hengist became a laboratory for the fusion of Germanic and Romano-British traditions, creating distinctive cultural forms that would influence English development for centuries to come. Germanic artistic styles blended with Romano-British craftsmanship to produce remarkable jewelry, weapons, and decorative objects that reflected the complex cultural heritage of the emerging kingdom. Religious practices during this period were particularly complex, as Germanic pagan traditions encountered both Romano-British Christianity and older Celtic religious practices. Rather than attempting to impose religious uniformity, Hengist generally adopted a pragmatic approach that allowed different communities to maintain their traditional practices while gradually building bridges between different religious communities. This religious tolerance had practical as well as spiritual dimensions. Many Romano-British inhabitants of Kent had been Christian for generations, and attempting to forcibly convert them to Germanic paganism would have created unnecessary resistance and instability. By allowing Christians to maintain their faith while also permitting Germanic religious practices, Hengist created space for the gradual cultural integration that made his kingdom more stable and prosperous. The economic foundations of Hengist's kingdom were equally important to its long-term success. Kent's strategic position made it a natural center for trade between Britain and the continental mainland, and the kingdom's rulers were quick to exploit this geographic advantage. Germanic settlers brought with them extensive knowledge of North Sea trade networks, while Romano-British inhabitants contributed understanding of Mediterranean commercial connections. This combination of trade networks created remarkable prosperity for Kent during the later years of Hengist's reign. Archaeological evidence suggests that Kentish communities during this period enjoyed access to luxury goods from across Europe: amber from the Baltic, silver from the Rhine Valley, pottery from Gaul, and exotic spices from even more distant regions. This prosperity served as both a foundation for political stability and a powerful incentive for continued loyalty to Germanic rule. As Hengist aged, questions of succession naturally became more pressing. Germanic tradition emphasized the importance of kinship ties in determining royal succession, but it did not mandate strict primogeniture. Multiple potential heirs could have legitimate claims, creating the possibility of civil war and political fragmentation upon a ruler's death. To address this challenge, Hengist took careful steps to designate his preferred successor and build support for that choice among the kingdom's nobility. The exact details of this succession planning vary between different historical sources, but most agree that Hengist ultimately selected his son Oisc, also known as Uric, as his heir and designated successor. Oisc represented an interesting choice for succession, as he embodied both the military prowess that had brought his father to power and the political sophistication necessary for governing a settled kingdom. Unlike Hengist, who had come to Britain as a warrior seeking opportunity, Oisc had been born and raised in Kent, making him a bridge between the Germanic settlers and the Romano-British population. The transition of power from Hengist to Oisc around 488 CE marked another crucial moment in the development of the Kingdom of Kent. This succession represented the first peaceful transfer of royal authority in the Germanic kingdom, establishing important precedents for future successions and demonstrating the stability that Hengist's institution building had achieved. Under Oisc's rule, the Kingdom of Kent continued to develop its distinctive character as a hybrid Germanic Romano-British state. The new king faced different challenges than his father, as his primary concerns shifted from conquest and consolidation to administration and diplomacy. The military campaigns that had dominated Hengist's reign gave way to more complex political maneuvering, as Kent took its place among the emerging kingdoms of early medieval Britain. Oisc's reign lasted approximately 24 years, from 488 to 512 CE, during which time the kingdom continued to prosper and expand its influence. The king proved adept at managing the complex web of relationships with neighboring British kingdoms, other Germanic settlements, and the various tribal groups that continued to arrive from continental Europe. However, despite Oisc's successes, his reign was also marked by growing external pressures that would profoundly influence the challenges facing his successor. The early 6th century saw the emergence of organized British resistance to Germanic expansion, led by figures whose names would echo through legend and chronicle for centuries to come. Most significant among these resistance leaders was a military commander known to later generations as Arthur, a figure whose historical reality remains debated, but whose impact on the political landscape of early 6th century Britain was undeniably profound. Whether Arthur was a single historical individual, a composite figure based on multiple leaders, or a largely legendary creation, the campaigns associated with his name represented a serious challenge to Germanic kingdoms throughout Britain. The threat posed by this British resurgence was particularly acute for Kent, which occupied a crucial strategic position that made it both valuable and vulnerable. The kingdom's wealth and its control of cross-channel trade routes made it an attractive target for British forces seeking to reverse Germanic gains, while its coastal position made it difficult to defend against coordinated attacks from multiple directions. As Oisc's reign drew to a close, these mounting pressures created significant challenges for the kingdom's future leadership. The next king would need to combine the military skills of Hengist with the administrative abilities of Uisc, while also developing new strategies for dealing with threats that were more sophisticated and better organized than anything the kingdom had previously faced. It was into this complex and dangerous world that Octha would emerge as king, inheriting not just the crown of Kent, but also the accumulated challenges and opportunities that 3 generations of Germanic rule had created. His reign would test whether the institutions and traditions established by his predecessors were strong enough to survive the greatest threats the kingdom had yet faced. The exact circumstances surrounding Octa's ascension to the throne of Kent remain shrouded in the mists of incomplete historical records and conflicting chronicle accounts. What emerges from this fog of uncertainty is the portrait of a ruler who came to power at one of the most challenging moments in his kingdom's brief history, facing threats that would test every aspect of the political and military structure his predecessors had so carefully constructed. Most historical sources place Octa's accession somewhere between 512 and 516 CE, following the death of his father Uisc, after a reign of nearly a quarter century. However, the transition was likely neither as smooth nor as straightforward as later chroniclers would suggest. The Kingdom of Kent in the early 6th century remained a relatively new political entity, its institutions still dependent on personal loyalties and kinship ties that could be disrupted by succession crises. Germanic traditions regarding royal succession were complex and sometimes contradictory, emphasizing both the importance of bloodline descent and the practical necessity of choosing leaders capable of effective rule. While Uisc had clearly designated Octha as his preferred heir, the young prince still needed to demonstrate his worthiness to the kingdom's nobles, warriors, and common people, who would ultimately determine the success or failure of his reign. The challenges facing the new king were immediately apparent to anyone familiar with the political landscape of early 6th century Britain. The British resurgence that had begun to manifest during the later years of Uisc's reign was gathering momentum under the leadership of figures whose military and political capabilities far exceeded anything the Germanic kingdoms had previously encountered. This British resistance was qualitatively different from the fragmented opposition that Hengist and Uisc had faced during their campaigns of conquest and consolidation. Rather than relying on local militias and temporary alliances, the new resistance appeared to be centrally coordinated, professionally organized, and strategically sophisticated in ways that posed unprecedented challenges to Germanic territorial gains. Archaeological evidence from this period suggests that the British forces opposing Germanic expansion had access to substantial resources, including high-quality weapons, sophisticated fortification techniques, and logistical capabilities that enabled sustained military campaigns rather than the hit-and-run raids that had characterized earlier resistance efforts. This evidence points to a level of political and military organization that implied strong central leadership and effective coordination between previously fragmented British territories. For Octha, the implications of this organized British resistance were profound and immediate, unlike his father and grandfather, who had faced opponents handicapped by political fragmentation and limited resources. The new king would need to defend Kent against enemies who possessed both the motivation and the capabilities to pose existential threats to Germanic rule. The strategic position that had been such an advantage during Kent's early development now became a potential liability. The kingdom's coastal location and its control of crucial trade routes made it a natural target for British forces seeking to strike at the heart of Germanic power. At the same time, Kent's prosperity and political stability made it a symbol of Germanic success that British leaders were particularly motivated to destroy. Octa's response to these challenges reveals much about his character and his understanding of the political realities facing his kingdom. Rather than adopting the aggressive expansionist policies that had characterized his predecessors' reigns, the new king appears to have pursued a more defensive strategy focused on consolidating and protecting existing territorial gains, rather than seeking new conquests. This strategic shift reflected not weakness but wisdom, as Octha recognized that the changed political landscape required different approaches than those that had brought his family to power. The days when small bands of Germanic warriors could carve out kingdoms through superior military technique and political opportunism were ending, replaced by an era in which survival would depend on careful resource management, strategic alliances, and defensive preparation. The king's early years were largely devoted to strengthening Kent's defensive capabilities and improving the kingdom's internal organization. Archaeological evidence suggests that this period saw significant investment in fortification construction, with new defensive works appearing at strategic locations throughout the kingdom. These fortifications represented a departure from earlier Germanic military traditions, incorporating techniques learned from both Roman engineering practices and British defensive innovations. More importantly, Octha appears to have invested considerable effort in building and maintaining relationships with other Germanic kingdoms throughout Britain. The political fragmentation that had characterized the early Anglo-Saxon period was gradually giving way to a more complex system of alliances and rivalries between established kingdoms, and Kent's future security would depend on its ability to navigate this emerging political landscape effectively. The king's diplomatic efforts extended beyond purely military alliances to include commercial and cultural relationships that strengthened Kent's position in multiple ways. Trade networks that had developed during his predecessors' reigns were expanded and formalized, creating economic relationships that gave other kingdoms practical incentives to support Kent's independence and prosperity. These commercial relationships were particularly important given Kent's strategic position controlling cross-channel trade routes. The kingdom's merchants and craftsmen had access to continental markets that were largely closed to inland Germanic settlements, creating opportunities for prosperity that could be shared with allies in exchange for political and military support. Cultural exchange was equally significant in Octha's diplomatic strategy. Kent, under his rule, became a center for the development of distinctive Anglo-Saxon artistic and literary traditions that combined Germanic cultural elements with Romano-British and continental influences. This cultural synthesis created a shared identity that helped bind together the diverse populations under Germanic rule, while also establishing Kent's reputation as a center of sophistication and learning. The religious landscape during Octha's reign was particularly complex, as the kingdom found itself at the intersection of competing religious traditions that reflected its diverse cultural heritage. Germanic pagan practices remained strong among the warrior nobility and recent settlers from continental Europe, while Romano-British Christianity maintained deep roots among the indigenous population. Rather than attempting to impose religious uniformity, Octha appears to have continued his predecessor's policy of religious tolerance, while gradually encouraging the development of syncretic practices that combined elements from different traditions. This approach reflected both practical political considerations and a genuine recognition that religious diversity could be a source of cultural strength rather than division. Archaeological evidence from religious sites dating to Octha's reign shows fascinating examples of this religious synthesis. Germanic religious symbols appear alongside Christian imagery in ways that suggest not conflict, but creative adaptation, as different religious communities found ways to coexist and even collaborate in developing new forms of spiritual expression. The king's court during this period appears to have been a remarkably sophisticated institution that served as both a center of political administration and a focal point for cultural development. Unlike the primarily military organizations that had characterized earlier Germanic leadership, Octa's court included specialists in law, trade, diplomacy, and religious affairs, who contributed to the kingdom's growing administrative complexity. This institutional development reflected Octa's understanding that effective rule in the changing political landscape required more than personal charisma and military prowess. The challenges facing Kent demanded systematic approaches to governance that could function effectively even when the king was absent on military campaigns or diplomatic missions. The legal traditions developed during Octa's reign were particularly significant, as they represented one of the earliest attempts to create comprehensive legal codes that address the needs of ethnically and culturally diverse populations under Germanic rule. These legal innovations combined Germanic customary law with Romano-British legal principles and practical solutions to problems that had not existed in earlier, simpler political systems. Economic development during this period was equally impressive, as Kent's merchants and craftsmen took advantage of the kingdom's political stability and strategic position to develop trade networks that extended throughout Europe. Kentish goods, particularly luxury items like jewelry, textiles, and metalwork, gained reputations for quality and craftsmanship that opened markets from Ireland to the Byzantine Empire. This economic prosperity served multiple political purposes beyond simply generating wealth for the kingdom. Trade relationships created diplomatic opportunities and provided practical incentives for peaceful relations with neighboring kingdoms. At the same time, the kingdom's reputation for prosperity and stability attracted skilled immigrants whose contributions further strengthened Kent's economic and cultural development. However, despite these achievements, Octa's reign was increasingly overshadowed by the growing threat posed by organized British resistance. Intelligence reports reaching the king's court painted an alarming picture of British military preparations that suggested coordinated planning for major offensive operations against Germanic territories throughout Britain. The British resistance had apparently learned from earlier failures and was now approaching the conflict with Germanic kingdoms as a systematic campaign rather than a series of isolated actions. This strategic evolution posed challenges that required equally systematic responses, forcing Octa to devote increasing attention and resources to military preparation and alliance building. The king's military preparations during this period reveal both his strategic insight and his understanding of the changed nature of the conflict his kingdom faced. Rather than relying primarily on the warrior bands that had served his predecessors well, Octa began developing more professional military forces that could sustain longer campaigns and coordinate effectively with allied forces from other kingdoms. These military innovations included improvements in weapons technology, fortification design, and logistical organization that reflected lessons learned from studying British resistance tactics. The king appears to have been particularly interested in developing cavalry forces that could match the mounted warriors that British leaders were using with increasing effectiveness. Training and organization of these new military forces required substantial investments in both time and resources, forcing Octa to balance immediate defensive needs against long-term strategic development. The kingdom's prosperity made these investments possible, but they also created opportunity costs that limited resources available for other aspects of governance and development. As the British threat continued to grow throughout the later years of Octa's reign, the king faced increasingly difficult decisions about resource allocation and strategic priorities. The defensive measures that had initially seemed adequate were proving insufficient against opponents whose capabilities were evolving more rapidly than anyone had anticipated. The mounting pressure created by this evolving threat would ultimately define the legacy of Octa's reign, as later chroniclers would remember him primarily for his role in the great conflict between British and Germanic forces that would reshape the political landscape of early medieval Britain. However, This focus on military affairs tends to obscure the substantial achievements in governance, diplomacy, and cultural development that characterized his rule during more peaceful periods. The emergence of coordinated British resistance during Octa's reign represented a fundamental shift in the nature of conflict in early medieval Britain. No longer could Germanic kingdoms rely on the political fragmentation and limited military capabilities that had made their initial conquest possible. Instead, they faced opponents who combined traditional British fighting skills with improved organization, strategic thinking, and access to resources that made them formidable adversaries. The leader most closely associated with this British resurgence was the enigmatic figure known to later generations as Arthur, a name that would echo through centuries of legend and literature, but whose historical reality remains tantalizingly obscure. Whether Arthur represented a single exceptional military commander, a composite figure based on multiple British leaders, or a largely mythical creation that embodied British hopes and Germanic fears, the campaigns associated with his name posed existential challenges to every Germanic kingdom in Britain. For Octa and the Kingdom of Kent, the Arthurian threat was particularly acute due to the kingdom's strategic importance and symbolic value. Kent represented the oldest and most successful Germanic settlement in Britain, its prosperity and stability serving as proof that Germanic rule could provide peace and prosperity for both conquerors and conquered. The destruction of Kent would therefore carry psychological and political significance far beyond the military value of the territory itself. The military campaigns traditionally associated with Arthur's name reveal a level of strategic sophistication that marked a dramatic departure from earlier patterns of British resistance. Rather than relying on guerrilla tactics and hit-and-run raids, the British forces now demonstrated capabilities for sustained offensive operations, coordinated multi-front campaigns, and effective siege warfare that posed unprecedented challenges to Germanic defensive strategies. Archaeological evidence from fortifications dating to this period shows clear signs of systematic siege techniques being employed against Germanic strongholds. These techniques included not only traditional approaches like surrounding and starving out defenders, but also more sophisticated methods such as undermining walls, constructing siege engines, and coordinating attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. The implications of these tactical developments were profound for kingdoms like Kent that had previously relied on relatively simple defensive strategies. Fortifications that had been adequate against earlier forms of attack now required substantial reinforcement and redesign to withstand systematic siege warfare. These improvements demanded significant investments in both material resources and skilled labor that strained the kingdom's capabilities. More challenging still was the coordination demonstrated by British forces across multiple theatres of operation. Rather than focusing their efforts on a single target, the British resistance appeared capable of conducting simultaneous campaigns against different Germanic kingdoms, preventing their enemies from concentrating forces or providing mutual support during critical battles. This strategic coordination suggests a level of political unity among British territories that had not existed during the initial period of Germanic conquest. Whether this unity reflected the emergence of a single dominant leader or represented a confederation of previously independent kingdoms, it marked a fundamental change in the balance of power throughout post-Roman Britain. For Octa, these developments necessitated a complete re-evaluation of Kent's defensive strategy and diplomatic relationships. The kingdom could no longer rely on its own military resources to ensure security, but would need to develop more extensive alliance networks and coordinate defensive efforts with other Germanic kingdoms facing similar threats. The king's response to these challenges demonstrates both his strategic acumen and his understanding of the political realities facing Germanic rule in Britain. Rather than attempting to match British innovations through purely military means, Octha pursued a multifaceted approach that combined military preparation with diplomatic initiatives and economic strategies designed to undermine British unity. The diplomatic component of this strategy involved intensive negotiations with other Germanic kingdoms to develop coordinated defensive plans and mutual support agreements. These negotiations were complicated by traditional rivalries and competing interests, but the shared threat posed by British resistance created incentives for cooperation that had not previously existed. Archaeological evidence suggests that these diplomatic efforts bore fruit in the form of standardized military equipment, coordinated fortification designs, and shared intelligence networks that improved the Germanic kingdom's collective defensive capabilities. Trade relationships were also modified to ensure that critical military supplies could continue flowing even during periods of active conflict. The economic dimension of Octa's strategy was equally important, as the king recognized that British unity depended partly on the economic incentives that successful military campaigns could provide. By disrupting British trade networks and offering attractive terms to British territories willing to break with the resistance, Kent attempted to weaken the economic foundations that made sustained military campaigns possible. These economic warfare tactics included not only trade disruption, but also positive incentives such as preferential trading relationships, access to continental markets, and opportunities for peaceful cultural exchange. The goal was to create practical incentives for British territories to pursue accommodation rather than continued resistance, thereby fracturing the unity that made British resistance so formidable. However, despite these sophisticated defensive strategies, the pressure created by British resistance continued to mount throughout Octa's reign. Intelligence reports reaching the Kentish court described increasingly ambitious British military preparations, including the construction of new fortifications, the training of larger military forces, and diplomatic efforts to secure external support from Celtic territories in Ireland, Scotland, and continental Europe. The climactic confrontation between British and Germanic forces traditionally associated with the Battle of Mount Badon represents both the culmination of this escalating conflict and one of the most significant military defeats in the history of Anglo-Saxon England. While the exact date, location, and details of this engagement remain subjects of scholarly debate, its impact on the political landscape of early medieval Britain was undeniably profound. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources describe Badon as a devastating defeat for Germanic forces that halted their territorial expansion for a generation. The battle appears to have been fought sometime between 490 and 516 CE, most likely around 500, at a location that controlled important strategic routes in southwestern Britain. The scale of the British victory at Badon was apparently so complete that it fundamentally altered the balance of power throughout post-Roman Britain. Germanic kingdoms that had previously been expanding their territories were forced into defensive positions, while British territories that had been under constant pressure gained breathing space to reorganize and strengthen their own political and military institutions. For Octha and the Kingdom of Kent, the implications of Badon were particularly serious, despite the kingdom's distance from the battlefield itself. As the most prominent Germanic kingdom and a symbol of Anglo-Saxon success, Kent faced the possibility of coordinated British attacks designed to capitalize on the psychological impact of the Badon victory. The king's response to this crisis reveals much about his character and his understanding of the political realities facing Germanic rule in Britain. Rather than adopting a purely defensive posture or attempting desperate offensive operations, Octha appears to have pursued a strategy of strategic patience, combined with careful preparation for the long-term challenges that the changed political situation would create. This strategic approach involved significant investments in defensive fortifications, military training, and alliance relationships, that were designed to ensure Kent's survival during what was likely to be an extended period of British ascendancy. The kingdom's resources were systematically marshaled to create defensive capabilities that could withstand sustained pressure while maintaining the economic and political foundations necessary for eventual recovery. The fortification programs undertaken during this period were particularly impressive, involving not only the strengthening of existing defensive works, but also the construction of entirely new defensive systems that incorporated lessons learned from studying British siege techniques. These fortifications represented a synthesis of Germanic, Romano-British, and continental defensive innovations that created some of the most sophisticated military architecture of the early medieval period. Military training during this period also evolved significantly, as Kentish forces adapted their tactics and organization to address the challenges posed by British military innovations. Traditional Germanic emphasis on individual warrior prowess was supplemented by training in coordinated unit tactics, siege warfare, and defensive operations that required higher levels of discipline and organization than earlier military traditions had emphasized. The social and economic changes required to support these military developments were equally significant. Kent's traditional social structure, based on personal relationships between warriors and their leaders, had to be modified to support more professional military forces that required regular training, standardized equipment, and systematic logistical support. These social changes created both opportunities and challenges for Octa's rule. On one hand, the military necessities created justifications for increased royal authority and more systematic administration that strengthened the kingdom's long-term institutional development. On the other hand, traditional Germanic freedoms and social relationships were necessarily constrained by the demands of military efficiency and defensive preparation. The king's handling of these social tensions demonstrates considerable political skill, as he managed to implement necessary changes without provoking the internal conflicts that could have weakened the kingdom at its most vulnerable moment. This was accomplished through careful attention to traditional forms and customs, gradual implementation of changes, and consistent communication about the external threats that made these adaptations necessary. Religious and cultural developments during this period were equally complex, as the pressures of military conflict interacted with ongoing processes of cultural synthesis and religious evolution. The threat posed by British resistance, which was often portrayed in religious terms as Christian opposition to pagan Germanic rule, added religious dimensions to political and military conflicts. Octa's response to these religious challenges appears to have been characteristically nuanced, as he avoided both religious persecution and forced conversion, while encouraging forms of religious expression that could support, rather than undermine, political unity. This approach reflected both practical political considerations and a sophisticated understanding of the role that religious beliefs could play in either strengthening or weakening social cohesion. The cultural creativity that emerged from this period of crisis was remarkable, as Kentish artists, craftsmen, and storytellers developed new forms of expression that reflected the complex challenges and achievements of their time. Archaeological evidence suggests that this period saw the creation of some of the most sophisticated artistic works in early Anglo-Saxon England, including jewelry, weapons, and decorative objects that combined Germanic, Romano-British, and continental influences in innovative ways. These cultural developments served important political purposes beyond their intrinsic artistic value, as they helped maintain morale during difficult periods and created symbols of identity that could inspire loyalty and resistance to external pressure. The cultural sophistication of Kent during this period also served diplomatic purposes, as it demonstrated to potential allies and enemies alike that Germanic rule was compatible with high levels of civilization and cultural achievement. As Octa's reign progressed, the immediate crisis created by the Battle of Badon gradually evolved into a more complex political situation characterized by military stalemate, diplomatic maneuvering, and gradual adaptation to changed circumstances. The complete British victory that some may have expected following Badon failed to materialize, as Germanic kingdoms proved more resilient and adaptable than their enemies had anticipated. This resilience reflected not only military and political factors, but also deeper social and economic realities that made Germanic rule sustainable even under adverse conditions. The cultural synthesis that had developed in kingdoms like Kent created forms of identity and loyalty that transcended purely ethnic boundaries, while the economic prosperity generated by Germanic trade networks provided practical incentives for continued political stability. The long-term implications of this period of crisis and adaptation would extend far beyond Octa's own reign, establishing patterns of political development, military organization, and cultural synthesis that would influence English history for centuries to come. The survival of Germanic kingdoms despite the challenges posed by British resistance demonstrated the fundamental strength of the political and social institutions that leaders like Octha had carefully constructed and defended. The daily reality of ruling the Kingdom of Kent during the early 6th century bore little resemblance to the dramatic military campaigns and political crises that dominated chronicle accounts of the period. Between the moments of high drama lay months and years of patient administrative work, careful relationship management, and attention to the countless small details that determined whether a kingdom prospered or declined in the harsh realities of early medieval Britain. Octa's court, during the height of his reign, was a remarkably sophisticated institution that reflected both the Germanic warrior traditions from which it had emerged and the complex administrative requirements of governing a territorially based kingdom with diverse populations and extensive external relationships. The king's daily routine typically began before dawn, with private consultations with his most trusted advisors, reviewing intelligence reports from throughout Britain and the continental mainland. These early morning sessions were crucial to effective governance, as they allowed Octa to process information and make decisions before the formal business of the day began. Intelligence gathering during this period was a complex enterprise that relied on networks of merchants, diplomats, religious figures, and professional informants who provided information about political developments, military movements, and economic conditions throughout Britain and beyond. The quality of this intelligence network was one of Kent's crucial advantages over rival kingdoms, as its strategic position controlling cross-channel trade routes provided natural cover for information-gathering activities. Merchants traveling between Britain and the continent could observe political and military developments in multiple kingdoms, while diplomatic missions provided opportunities for more systematic intelligence collection. As dawn broke over the Kentish landscape, the king would typically proceed to the Great Hall, where he held public audiences and conducted the formal business of governance. These audiences were carefully choreographed events that served multiple purposes. They provided opportunities for subjects to present petitions and grievances, demonstrated the king's accessibility and concern for justice, and reinforced the social hierarchies and political relationships that maintained order throughout the kingdom. The physical setting of these royal audiences reflected the cultural synthesis that characterized Kentish society during Octa's reign. The Great Hall itself was constructed in traditional Germanic style, with massive timber posts supporting a high thatched roof and long benches arranged along the walls for nobles and warriors. However, the decorative elements incorporated Romano-British artistic traditions, continental influences, and increasingly sophisticated Germanic craftsmanship that created a distinctive aesthetic unique to early medieval Kent. The daily audiences revealed the remarkable diversity of issues requiring royal attention in a kingdom that was simultaneously a Germanic warrior society, a commercial centre connected to continental trade networks, and an administrative state governing mixed populations with different cultural traditions and legal expectations. On any given day, Octha might hear disputes over land ownership between Germanic and Romano-British families, mediate conflicts between merchants over trading rights, review military preparations for defensive operations, and consider diplomatic communications from neighbouring kingdoms. The legal traditions that governed these proceedings were themselves products of cultural synthesis, combining Germanic customary law with Romano-British legal principles and practical innovations developed to address problems unique to the mixed society of early medieval Kent. The king's role as ultimate legal authority was central to Germanic political traditions, but the actual administration of justice involved complex consultation with legal experts, community leaders, and representatives of different cultural traditions. One particularly complex category of cases involved property disputes between families of different ethnic backgrounds, as Germanic and Romano-British traditions regarding land ownership, inheritance, and family relationships differed significantly. Octha's court developed sophisticated procedures for resolving these disputes that attempted to respect both legal traditions while creating precedents that could guide future decisions. The economic cases that came before the royal court were equally complex, reflecting Kent's position at the centre of extensive trade networks, connecting Britain with the continental mainland and beyond. Disputes over commercial contracts, trading rights, quality standards, and payment terms required the king to balance the interests of different merchant communities while maintaining the broader economic relationships that supported the kingdom's prosperity. Military matters occupied an increasing portion of the king's attention as external threats mounted throughout his reign. Daily reports from frontier fortifications, intelligence about British military preparations, and coordination with allied Germanic kingdoms required systematic attention and careful decision-making. The king's military advisors formed a crucial component of the royal court, providing technical expertise and strategic advice that informed defensive preparations. The afternoon hours typically brought less formal interactions that were nonetheless crucial to effective governance. Octha would meet privately with individual nobles, warriors, merchants, and religious leaders to discuss matters too sensitive for public audiences or requiring more detailed discussion than formal proceedings allowed. These private consultations were essential for maintaining the complex web of personal relationships that undergirded royal authority in early medieval society. The king's relationship with the warrior nobility was particularly important, as their loyalty and military service formed the foundation of royal power. These relationships were maintained through a complex system of gift-giving, feast attendance, military companionship, and careful attention to honor and status that reflected traditional Germanic values. The king was expected to be generous with treasure won in battle, attentive to his warriors' needs, and personally courageous in military affairs. However, the changing nature of warfare during Octha's reign complicated these traditional relationships. The shift toward more defensive strategies, longer campaigns, and more professional military organization required adaptations to traditional warrior culture that could create tensions between established customs and practical military necessities. The king had to balance respect for tradition with the imperative need for military effectiveness in the face of sophisticated British opposition. The economic foundations of the kingdom required equally careful attention, as Kent's prosperity depended on maintaining complex trade relationships that extended throughout Europe. The king's role in economic affairs went far beyond simply collecting taxes and tribute. It involved active management of trade relationships, protection of merchant communities, maintenance of infrastructure like roads and ports, and negotiation of commercial agreements with other kingdoms. Kent's merchants during this period formed a diverse and sophisticated community that included both Germanic and Romano-British traders with connections throughout Europe. The luxury goods that made Kent prosperous, fine jewellery, decorated weapons, elaborate textiles, and sophisticated metalwork, required skilled craftsmen whose workshops were concentrated in the kingdom's commercial centres. The king's patronage of these craftsmen served both economic and political purposes. Royal commissions provided crucial income that supported the development of increasingly sophisticated techniques and styles, while the products themselves served as diplomatic gifts that strengthened political relationships and demonstrated Kent's cultural sophistication. The finest products of Kentish workshops during this period were treasured throughout Europe, creating a reputation that enhanced the kingdom's prestige and political influence. Agricultural production formed the foundation of the kingdom's economy, as it did throughout early medieval Europe. The fertile soils of Kent were particularly well suited to grain production, while the region's climate supported diverse crops that provided both sustenance for the population and surplus for trade. The management of agricultural resources required careful attention to seasonal rhythms, labour allocation, and the distribution of surplus production. The social organisation of agricultural production during this period reflected the complex heritage of Romano-British and Germanic traditions. Some areas retained elements of the villa system that had characterised Roman Britain, with large estates worked by dependent labourers under the direction of Romano-British or Germanic landowners. Other regions followed more traditional Germanic patterns, with free farmers working family holdings that could be inherited according to customary law. The king's role in managing these different agricultural systems was both direct and indirect. Royal estates throughout Kent provided models for effective agricultural management, while also generating revenue that supported the royal court and military forces. More broadly, the king's legal and administrative decisions shaped the conditions under which agricultural production occurred, influencing everything from labour relations to market access for surplus crops. Religious life during Octa's reign remained remarkably diverse, reflecting the multiple cultural traditions that had converged in early medieval Kent. Germanic pagan practices centered on warrior gods like Woden and Thuna coexisted with Romano-British Christianity and older Celtic religious traditions in a complex religious landscape that defied simple categorization. The king's approach to religious diversity reflected both personal beliefs and practical political considerations. Archaeological evidence suggests that Octa himself maintained traditional Germanic religious practices, participating in seasonal ceremonies and making offerings to the gods associated with warrior success and royal authority. However, he also demonstrated respect for Christian communities and protected their right to worship according to their traditions. This religious tolerance served important political purposes, as it helped maintain peace between different cultural communities, while also preventing the religious conflicts that plagued other early medieval kingdoms. The policy also reflected sophisticated understanding of the relationship between religious belief and political loyalty, as Octa recognized that attempts to impose religious uniformity would create resistance that could undermine political stability. The seasonal rhythms of royal governance reflected both practical necessities and cultural traditions that shaped life in early medieval Britain. Spring brought renewed military campaigning as weather improved and resources became available after winter scarcity. The king would typically spend these months reviewing defensive preparations, conducting military exercises, and coordinating with allied kingdoms about potential threats and joint defensive operations. Summer was the season of maximum military activity, as longer days and better weather favoured both offensive and defensive operations. During periods of active conflict, the king would personally lead military forces in the field, combining traditional Germanic expectations of royal military leadership with practical strategic necessities. Even during periods of relative peace, Summer military exercises and frontier patrols maintained military readiness while also demonstrating royal power and concern for the kingdom's defense. Autumn brought the harvest season, with its crucial importance for the kingdom's economic survival and military capabilities. The king's attention during these months focused heavily on ensuring successful harvest completion, proper storage of surplus production, and fair distribution of resources throughout the kingdom. Harvest festivals provided opportunities for the king to interact with common subjects, reinforcing social bonds and demonstrating royal concern for popular welfare. Winter months were traditionally a time of relative peace, as weather conditions limited military operations and made travel difficult. The king would typically return to his primary royal residence, where he would hold extended court sessions, conduct administrative business that had been deferred during the campaign season, and plan for the following year's challenges. The winter court was also a center of cultural activity, as the long dark evenings provided opportunities for storytelling, musical performance, and the transmission of cultural traditions that bound the kingdom's diverse populations together. Germanic Scots would recite traditional poems celebrating ancestral heroes and martial valor, while Romano-British storytellers contributed their own traditions, and Christian clerics offered religious instruction and moral guidance. These winter gatherings served crucial social and political functions beyond their entertainment value. They provided opportunities for the king to strengthen relationships with nobles and warriors through personal interaction, feasting, and gift-giving. The cultural performances transmitted values and traditions that reinforced social cohesion and political loyalty, while also creating shared cultural experiences that helped forge common identity across ethnic boundaries. The king's personal household during this period was a complex institution that combined private family life with public political functions. Octa's immediate family members occupied ambiguous positions as both private relations and public figures whose actions could have significant political implications. Marriage alliances, succession planning, and family relationships were all matters of state concern, as well as personal importance. The role of women in the royal household and broader Kentish society was more complex and significant than later stereotypes of Germanic warrior culture might suggest. Queens and noble women wielded considerable informal power through their control of household resources, their roles in negotiating marriage alliances, and their influence over royal decision-making. Archaeological evidence from high-status female burials during this period reveals women buried with symbols of authority and wealth that indicate genuine political and economic power. The education and training of potential heirs occupied significant attention in the royal household, as the survival of the kingdom depended on producing leaders capable of meeting the challenges of rule in an uncertain world. Young princes received training in martial skills, political strategy, legal traditions, and the complex web of relationships that maintained royal authority. This education combined traditional Germanic emphasis on personal courage and martial prowess with increasingly sophisticated understanding of administration, diplomacy, and statecraft. The religious education of royal children reflected the religious diversity of the kingdom, as even pagan royal families recognized the practical value of understanding Christian beliefs and Romano-British cultural traditions. Some evidence suggests that royal children received instruction from both pagan religious specialists and Christian clerics, creating a religiously eclectic education that prepared them for ruling diverse populations with different spiritual traditions. The king's personal spiritual life remains largely hidden from historical view, as the sources available to modern scholars provide little insight into private religious beliefs and practices. What can be discerned suggests a complex relationship with multiple religious traditions, combining traditional Germanic pagan practices with increasing exposure to Christian beliefs and Romano-British spiritual traditions. The royal court's relationship with religious institutions of all types was crucial to effective governance, as religious leaders wielded significant influence over their communities and could either support or undermine royal authority. Octha appears to have cultivated relationships with religious leaders across the spiritual spectrum, providing patronage to pagan religious sites, protecting Christian communities, and respecting the sacred places associated with older Celtic traditions. This multifaceted religious patronage served both spiritual and political purposes. It demonstrated royal respect for different religious traditions, helped maintain peace between communities with different beliefs, and created networks of religious leaders who could support royal policies and communicate royal messages to their followers. The king's generosity to religious institutions also fulfilled traditional expectations of royal behavior, while creating lasting monuments to royal piety and power. The architectural landscape of Kent during Octha's reign reflected the kingdom's cultural complexity and increasing sophistication. Royal residences combined Germanic building traditions with Romano-British architectural elements and increasingly elaborate decoration that demonstrated the kingdom's prosperity and cultural achievements. These structures served both practical and symbolic purposes, providing functional spaces for royal administration while also expressing royal power and the kingdom's distinctive cultural identity. The Great Hall remained the architectural and symbolic center of royal power, but it was increasingly supplemented by additional structures that reflected growing administrative complexity: private royal chambers, treasury buildings, quarters for permanent military forces, and specialized workshops for royal craftsmen created architectural complexes that resembled small towns more than the simple warrior halls of earlier Germanic tradition. The decoration of these royal buildings represented some of the finest artistic achievement of early Anglo-Saxon England. Wall hangings depicted heroic scenes from Germanic legend alongside Romano-British decorative motifs, while carved woodwork and metalwork demonstrated the sophisticated technical skills of Kentish craftsmen. These decorative programs served educational and political purposes, transmitting cultural values and celebrating royal achievements, while also demonstrating the kingdom's cultural sophistication to visitors and foreign diplomats. The material culture of the royal court extended beyond architecture to encompass the objects used in daily life, ceremonial occasions, and displays of royal power. Royal regalia during this period included crowns, scepters, ceremonial weapons, and elaborate jewelry that combined Germanic artistic traditions with Romano-British goldsmithing techniques and continental influences. These objects served as physical embodiments of royal authority, used in ceremonies that reinforce social hierarchies and political relationships. The king's personal possessions reveal much about the cultural synthesis that characterized Kentish society during this period. Archaeological evidence from royal burials of the era shows combinations of Germanic weapons and jewelry, Romano-British luxury goods, and continental imports that reflect the diverse cultural influences shaping elite society. These material possessions were not merely status symbols, but active participants in the social relationships that maintained political power. Gift-giving remained a central element of political culture throughout Octha's reign, serving to create and maintain the complex web of obligations and loyalties that sustained royal authority. The king was expected to be generous with treasure, weapons, land, and other valuable goods, rewarding loyal service and demonstrating the prosperity that effective leadership provided. This generosity was not optional, but essential to maintaining the political relationships on which royal power depended. The objects given as royal gifts were carefully selected to convey appropriate messages about the relationship between giver and recipient. Weapons given to warriors symbolized mutual obligations for military service and royal protection, while land grants to nobles created permanent relationships that bound families to the royal dynasty across generations. Diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers and religious offerings to spiritual institutions served different but equally important purposes in maintaining the kingdom's internal stability and external relationships. The feasting tradition that accompanied gift-giving was equally important to political culture, as shared meals created bonds of companionship and obligation that reinforced formal political relationships. The royal hall was regularly the scene of elaborate feasts that brought together the king and his followers in celebrations that combined practical political purposes with cultural traditions of hospitality and generosity. These feasts followed elaborate protocols that reflected social hierarchies, while also creating opportunities for personal interaction between the king and subjects of different ranks. Seating arrangements, the order of service, the quality of food and drink provided to different guests. All these details conveyed messages about social status and political relationships that participants understood implicitly. The food served at a royal feast reflected both the kingdom's agricultural productivity and its extensive trade connections. Local products like grain, meat, and ale were supplemented by imported luxuries, including wine from Gaul, exotic spices from Mediterranean regions, and specialty foods that demonstrated the kingdom's prosperity and the king's generosity. The abundance displayed at these feasts served propaganda purposes, demonstrating that royal leadership provided prosperity and security that benefited all subjects. The entertainment provided during royal feasts was equally important to their social and political functions. Professional performers, including musicians, storytellers, and poets, provided cultural experiences that transmitted values, celebrated royal achievements, and created shared experiences that bound diverse participants together. These performances were not merely entertainment, but active elements of political culture that shaped how subjects understood their relationship to royal authority and to each other. As evening fell and the day's formal business concluded, the king would typically retire to private chambers for personal time with family and intimate advisors. These private hours provided crucial opportunities for reflection, planning, and the personal relationships that sustained the emotional and psychological demands of royal leadership. Even in private, however, the king remained on duty, as messengers could arrive at any hour with urgent intelligence or requests for royal decisions on time-sensitive matters. The sleep that finally came to the king at the end of these long days was often troubled by the weight of responsibilities and the constant awareness of threats facing the kingdom. The burden of leadership in such uncertain times took its toll on even the strongest rulers, requiring reserves of physical stamina, emotional resilience, and spiritual strength that not all possessed in sufficient measure. The final years of Octa's reign saw the gradual transformation of the immediate crisis created by British resistance into a more stable, if still challenging, political situation. The complete conquest that British leaders had hoped to achieve following their victory at Badon failed to materialize, while Germanic kingdoms demonstrated surprising resilience in adapting to changed circumstances and maintaining their territorial holdings despite continued pressure. This military stalemate reflected deeper realities about the nature of political power and social organization in early medieval Britain. The Germanic kingdoms had sunk roots too deep to be easily uprooted, creating forms of political organization, economic relationships, and cultural synthesis that proved sustainable even under adverse conditions. At the same time, British territories retained sufficient strength and organization to prevent further Germanic expansion, creating a balance of power that would persist for generations. For Kent, under Octa's leadership, this period of stabilization brought both relief and new challenges. The immediate threat of conquest receded, as it became clear that British forces lacked the resources for sustained offensive operations deep into Germanic territory. However, the kingdom remained under constant pressure from border conflicts, diplomatic maneuvering, and the need to maintain expensive defensive preparations against potential renewed British offensives. The king's response to these evolving circumstances demonstrated the wisdom and adaptability that had characterized his approach to governance throughout his reign. Rather than attempting to return to the expansionist policies of earlier periods or maintaining maximum defensive mobilization indefinitely, Octha pursued a strategy of gradual normalization that reduced military tensions while maintaining essential defensive capabilities. This normalization process involved complex diplomatic negotiations with British territories, careful coordination with allied Germanic kingdoms, and internal adjustments to reduce the economic and social strains created by years of military mobilization. The goal was to create sustainable arrangements that could preserve the kingdom's security and prosperity over the long term, rather than simply responding to immediate threats. The diplomatic initiatives undertaken during this period were particularly significant, as they established patterns of interaction between British and Germanic territories that would influence political relationships for generations. Rather than viewing the conflict in zero-sum terms, where one side's gain was necessarily the other's loss, these diplomatic efforts sought areas of mutual benefit where cooperation could serve interests of multiple kingdoms regardless of ethnic identity. Trade relationships formed a crucial element of these diplomatic initiatives, as economic interdependence created practical incentives for peaceful relations that could survive political tensions. Kentish merchants had long established connections with Romano-British commercial networks, and these relationships provided foundations for broader political accommodation between territories that remained military rivals but recognized mutual benefits from commercial cooperation. Religious relationships also contributed to diplomatic normalization, as Christian communities in Kent maintained connections with British Christian territories that transcended political boundaries. While Octha himself remained pagan, he recognized the diplomatic value of these religious connections and protected Christian communities' ability to maintain relationships with co-religionists in British territories. The internal reforms undertaken during the later years of Octha's reign laid important foundations for the kingdom's long-term development. The military mobilization and defensive preparations that had dominated earlier periods had required significant institutional development, creating administrative capabilities and organizational structures that could be adapted for peacetime purposes. The king's recognition of these opportunities demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how crisis-driven changes could be leveraged for broader political development. Legal reforms during this period were particularly significant, as the King's Court developed increasingly systematic approaches to law that combined different legal traditions into coherent frameworks addressing the needs of diverse populations. These legal developments reflected both practical necessities and growing sophistication in understanding how legal systems could contribute to political stability and social cohesion. The economic policies developed during this period established patterns that would characterize Kentish prosperity for centuries. The kingdom's strategic position was systematically exploited to develop trade networks that connected Britain with continental Europe, creating commercial relationships that survived political upheavals and provided stable foundations for economic growth. Royal policies encouraged merchant activity, protected commercial infrastructure, and maintained the stable political conditions that made Kent attractive to traders from throughout Europe. Cultural developments during the later years of Octha's reign demonstrated increasing confidence and sophistication, as Kentish artists and craftsmen developed distinctive styles that synthesized Germanic, Romano-British, and continental influences into unique aesthetic forms. This cultural creativity reflected both the prosperity that provided resources for artistic patronage and the complex cultural interactions that characterize Kentish society. The religious landscape continued evolving during this period, as ongoing cultural synthesis created new forms of religious expression that combined elements from different spiritual traditions. While clear religious boundaries remained, there was also increasing religious interchange and the development of syncretic practices that incorporated elements from multiple traditions. This religious evolution would have profound implications for Kent's later history, creating conditions that made possible the kingdom's relatively smooth conversion to Christianity in subsequent generations. As Octa's reign drew toward its close, questions of succession naturally became more pressing. The king appears to have taken careful steps to designate his preferred heir and build support for a smooth transition of power. Unlike the uncertain succession that had marked his own accession, Octa sought to create conditions where his successor could assume power without the conflicts and uncertainties that could weaken the kingdom at a vulnerable moment. The choice of Eormenric as designated heir reflected both traditional Germanic succession principles and practical political considerations. As Octa's son, Eormenric had the bloodline credentials that Germanic tradition emphasized, while his upbringing in the royal court had provided training in the arts of governance that the kingdom's complex challenges demanded. The young prince had also demonstrated military capability and political judgment that suggested he could effectively lead the kingdom through future challenges. The preparation of Eormenric for eventual kingship occupied significant attention during the final years of Octa's reign. The designated heir was given increasing responsibilities in royal administration, military command, and diplomatic affairs, allowing him to develop the skills and relationships necessary for effective rule. This careful succession planning reflected Octa's understanding that the kingdom's long-term stability depended on smooth transitions of power that preserved institutional continuity and political relationships. The circumstances surrounding Octa's death remain uncertain, as the historical sources provide conflicting accounts about both the date and the manner of his passing. Some sources suggest he died peacefully around 534 CE, after approximately 22 years of rule, while others indicate a later date around 540 CE. The exact cause of death is not recorded, though given the life expectancy and health challenges of the early medieval period, natural causes seem most likely. What is clear is that Octa's death marked the end of an era in Kent's history. His reign had spanned one of the most challenging periods the kingdom had faced, encompassing the British resurgence, the military setbacks following Badon, and the difficult process of adaptation to changed political circumstances. That the kingdom not only survived these challenges, but emerged stronger and more stable than before, represents a testament to Octa's leadership and the institutional foundations he had strengthened during his rule. The succession of Eormenric appears to have proceeded smoothly, suggesting that Octa's careful preparation had achieved its intended purpose. The new king inherited a kingdom that was stable, prosperous, and possessed of the administrative capabilities and political relationships necessary to face future challenges. This successful transition represented perhaps Octa's greatest achievement, as it demonstrated that the kingdom had developed institutional strength that could survive the death of individual rulers. The immediate impact of Octa's reign was most visible in Kent itself, where the king's defensive strategies and administrative reforms had created unprecedented stability and prosperity. The kingdom that Eormenric inherited was significantly stronger than the realm Octa had received from his father, with improved fortifications, more sophisticated administrative systems, and more extensive diplomatic relationships that enhanced security and supported economic development. However, Octa's influence extended beyond Kent's borders to affect the broader development of Anglo-Saxon England. The defensive strategies he had pioneered in response to British resistance were adopted by other Germanic kingdoms, while the cultural synthesis he had encouraged in Kent provided models for similar developments elsewhere. The administrative innovations developed in his kingdom influenced political organization throughout Anglo-Saxon England, contributing to the gradual emergence of more sophisticated governmental structures. The relationship between Octa's historical legacy and his treatment in later chronicles reveals much about how early medieval history was remembered and recorded. The king, who had presided over such significant developments in his own time, became in later accounts a shadowy figure whose achievements were obscured by the dramatic legends surrounding figures like Arthur and the founders of other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. This historical obscurity reflects partly the nature of early medieval record-keeping, which often focused on dramatic events and legendary figures, while paying less attention to the patient administrative work and defensive strategies that actually determined political outcomes. Octa's reign lacked the legendary drama of founding conquests or spectacular military victories, instead demonstrating the less glamorous but ultimately more important qualities of strategic wisdom, administrative competence, and political adaptability. The Historia Britonum's treatment of Octa is particularly interesting, as it places him in direct opposition to the legendary Arthur, making him a representative of Germanic resistance to British resurgence. This portrayal, while not entirely inaccurate in its broad outline, simplified a complex historical relationship and transformed Octa into a literary foil for British heroism, rather than a historical figure in his own right. Geoffrey of Monmouth's later and more elaborate account carried this process of literary transformation even further, creating dramatic narratives of battles, captures, escapes, and final defeat that bear little relationship to historical reality, but reveal much about medieval attitudes toward the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain. In Geoffrey's telling, Octa becomes a character in an epic drama, his historical achievements subordinated to narrative requirements and symbolic purposes. These legendary treatments, while historically unreliable, had their own significant impacts on how later generations understood early English history. The dramatic narratives created by Geoffrey and other medieval chroniclers shaped popular understanding of the Anglo-Saxon period for centuries, creating mythic frameworks that influenced everything from political rhetoric to literary tradition. Octa's role in these narratives, while distorted, ensured that his name at least remained known to later generations. Modern historical scholarship has gradually worked to recover the historical Octa from beneath the layers of legend and literary invention. Archaeological evidence from Kent during the early 6th century provides material confirmation of the prosperity and stability that characterized the kingdom during this period. Excavations of settlement sites, fortifications, and burial grounds reveal a society that was both materially prosperous and culturally sophisticated, consistent with effective political leadership and stable governance. Comparative analysis of early medieval kingdoms throughout Europe provides additional context for understanding Octa's achievements, the challenges he faced, consolidating territorial gains, adapting to changed military circumstances, managing culturally diverse populations, and maintaining political stability during periods of external pressure, were common to early medieval rulers throughout the former Roman Empire. Octa's success in addressing these challenges places him among the more effective leaders of his era, even if his achievements lack the legendary glamour of more famous figures. The linguistic evidence from place names and legal terminology in Kent provides further insights into the cultural synthesis that characterized Octa's reign. The preservation of Romano-British place names alongside Germanic linguistic innovations suggests a society where different cultural traditions coexisted and influenced each other, rather than one simply replacing the other. This linguistic evidence confirms the picture of cultural accommodation and synthesis that other sources suggest characterized Kent during this period. The religious evidence is particularly fascinating. as it reveals complex processes of spiritual change and adaptation that transcended simple narratives of pagan-Christian conflict. Archaeological excavations of religious sites from this period show evidence of religious practices that combine Germanic, Romano-British, and even earlier Celtic elements in ways that suggest creative adaptation, rather than rigid adherence to single religious traditions. The artistic evidence from Kent during Octa's reign demonstrates remarkable sophistication and creativity, as craftsmen developed styles that synthesized influences from multiple cultural traditions into distinctive aesthetic forms. The jewelry, weapons, and decorative objects produced during this period are among the finest examples of early Anglo-Saxon craftsmanship, revealing a society with both the material resources and the cultural confidence to support high levels of artistic achievement. The broader impact of Octa's reign on English history becomes clearer when viewed in long-term perspective. The stability and prosperity he helped maintain in Kent created conditions for the kingdom's later emergence as the first Anglo-Saxon kingdom to convert to Christianity, and subsequently one of the most influential political and cultural centres in early medieval England. The institutional foundations he strengthened provided frameworks for this later development, making possible achievements that would have been impossible without the work done during his reign. The conversion of Kent to Christianity under Octa's grandson Ethelbert represented a culmination of processes that had begun during earlier reigns. The religious tolerance Octa had practiced, the cultural synthesis he had encouraged, and the stable political institutions he had maintained created conditions where Christianity could be introduced without the social upheaval that characterized religious conversion in other early medieval societies. The relationship between Octa's legacy and later Kentish prominence is complex but undeniable. Each subsequent achievement of the Kentish kingdom built on foundations laid during earlier reigns, including the defensive preparations, administrative innovations, and cultural developments of Octa's time. The kingdom's later role as a centre of Christian learning, artistic achievement, and political power would have been impossible without the stability and prosperity that leaders like Octa had worked to create and maintain. The demographic realities of early medieval Kent also reflect Octa's policies and their long-term implications. The kingdom's population during this period included significant Romano-British elements alongside Germanic settlers, creating an ethnically mixed society that distinguished Kent from some other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, where Germanic settlement was more demographically dominant. This ethnic diversity, carefully managed during Octa's reign, contributed to Kent's distinctive cultural character and its particular openness to continental influences. The economic foundations laid during Octa's reign had equally long-lasting impacts. The trade networks he encouraged and protected continued to function for centuries, making Kent one of the most commercially connected regions in early medieval Britain. The kingdom's prosperity derived partly from these commercial relationships, which survived political changes and provided stable economic foundations for social and cultural development. The legal traditions developed during Octa's reign influenced not only Kent, but broader Anglo-Saxon legal development. The synthesis of Germanic and Romano-British legal principles that occurred in Kent provided models that other kingdoms studied and adapted to their own circumstances. The later Kentish legal codes that are among the earliest surviving examples of Anglo-Saxon law, built on foundations established during earlier reigns including Octa's. The military innovations of Octa's reign had implications beyond his own kingdom and time. The defensive strategies and fortification techniques developed in response to British pressure were studied and adopted by other Germanic kingdoms, contributing to broader military evolution throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The integration of Romano-British defensive knowledge with Germanic military traditions that occurred under Octa's leadership, represented an important step in the military development that would eventually enable Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to defend themselves against later Viking invasions. The cultural confidence that characterized later Kentish society had roots in the cultural policies of Octa's reign. By encouraging synthesis rather than replacement of different cultural traditions, by supporting artistic and crafts production that drew on multiple influences, and by maintaining stability that allowed cultural development to flourish, Octa helped create conditions where distinctive Anglo-Saxon cultural forms could emerge. The religious evolution that would transform Kent into a centre of Christian learning and missionary activity began with the religious policies of earlier pagan kings like Octa, the tolerance practiced toward Christian communities, the protection of religious diversity, and the gradual cultural interchange between different religious traditions created foundations for later religious transformation. When Christianity eventually became the kingdom's official religion, the transition was relatively smooth, partly because groundwork had been laid during earlier periods. In the final analysis, Octa's legacy rests not on dramatic military victories or legendary adventures, but on the patient work of governance, the wisdom of defensive strategy, and the careful cultivation of institutional strength that allowed his kingdom to survive and prosper during one of the most challenging periods in its history. His reign demonstrated that effective leadership in early medieval Britain required not just martial prowess, but political wisdom, administrative competence, and strategic vision that could guide kingdoms through complex challenges. The shadow that gave him his later sobriquet was not a sign of failure or insignificance, but rather the inevitable obscurity that time casts over leaders whose greatest achievements were stability, prosperity, and the preservation of political institutions through challenging times. These accomplishments, while less dramatic than legendary conquests, were ultimately more important to the long-term development of English history. Octa's story reminds us that history's greatest leaders are not always those whose names echo most loudly through the centuries. Sometimes the most important leadership occurs in moments of crisis management, institutional development, and strategic adaptation that lack the drama that later chroniclers find most interesting. The shadowy successor of Kent may not have achieved legendary fame, but his reign marked a crucial period in the transformation of post-Roman Britain into medieval England. As we close this gentle journey through the mists of early medieval Kent, let Octa's story carry you softly toward peaceful sleep. His was a life lived in shadow, but shadows are not emptiness. They are spaces between light and darkness where quiet work is done, where foundations are laid, where the patient labor of building something lasting occurs away from the glare of legend and chronicle. In those shadows, Octa maintained a kingdom through times that might have destroyed it. He preserved institutions that would serve Kent for centuries. He cultivated cultural synthesis that would enrich English civilization. And he demonstrated that true leadership sometimes means doing the necessary work without concern for historical glory. So rest now, dear listener, as the shadowy king himself might have rested after long days of patient governance, knowing that his work had been done well and that his kingdom would endure. Let the gentle rhythms of 6th century Kent carry you into dreams, where perhaps you might glimpse the great halls where Octa held court, the fortifications he strengthened, the merchant ships that brought prosperity to his realm, and the peaceful fields where his subjects prospered under his careful rule. Sleep well, knowing that history is made not only in moments of high drama, but in the quiet work of countless days, in the patience of defensive preparation, in the wisdom of cultural tolerance, and in the steady hands of leaders who understand that true success is measured not in legendary fame, but in the prosperity and security they provide for those they lead. Good night, sweet dreamer. May Octa's wisdom guide you through your own shadows toward peaceful morning light. Thank you for joining us on this peaceful journey through the shadows of early medieval Kent. If you enjoyed this calming tale from history, please share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear which aspects of Octa's reign fascinated you most. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Sleepy Crown for more soothing historical documentaries that carry you gently into restful sleep. Until next time, sleep peacefully, dear friends.